Well, kind of the theme of many of the topics, the Friday night Bible study and the sermonette today and the Bible study today is learning about God through nature, through His creation, what He has given us and provided for us. And as an introduction, I want to kind of read a couple verses from probably one of my all-time favorite hymns. It just, to me, this hymn discusses all of God's plan, and I just absolutely love it. I'm going to read How Great Thou Art, a couple verses. I just want us to kind of think about these words as I read them and how they draw upon learning about God. How great Thou art, O Lord my God, when I in awesome wonder consider all the works Thy hands have made. I see the stars, I hear the mighty thunder, Thy power throughout the universe displayed. Then sings my soul, my Savior God, to Thee, how great Thou art, how great Thou art. Then sings my soul, my Savior God, to Thee, how great Thou art, how great Thou art. When through the woods and forest glades I wander, and hear the birds sing sweetly in the trees. When I look down from lofty mountain grandeur, and hear the brook, and feel the gentle breeze. Then sings my soul, my Savior God, to Thee, how great Thou art, how great Thou art. I don't know if you've had the chance to go up into the mountains and look down from there and see the grandeur. I know some people used to go skiing a lot, and so you went up to the top of the hills and you got to see the viewpoint. Some people have been to the feast site in Colorado or up in the West Virginia mountains and the Appalachian Mountains. This past year we had the privilege of going to Switzerland before the feast and looking out in the Swiss Alps and seeing the viewscapes that you saw. We sang this song. We just sat there and it was just so inspiring and so, it just drew you so close to God. We had to sing this song together because we saw how great God was. We saw how little we seen being on top of the mountain of how far you could see. Part of my job is working out in the streams and going out into the woods. So often I get to walk through the forests and walk through the stream. And today we've heard the brook babbling along. We've got to experience much of God's creation. We've got to hear the birds sing sweetly in the trees. Have we considered, have we taken thoughts of how great God is while we've listened to these things this weekend? Well, today in the Bible study, I'd like us to go through Scripture and look at several aspects of what we can learn from God, from nature. The first point that I'd like to touch on is we get wisdom through nature. Let's turn to 1 Kings and chapter 4. Solomon was described as the wisest man who lived in the earth. People came from all over the world to listen to Solomon's wisdom. 1 Kings chapter 4 and verse 30 through 34. In verse 30 it states, Solomon's wisdom surpassed the wisdom of all the sons of the east and all of the wisdom of Egypt. He was wiser than all men, than Ethan the Ezrahite, Heman the Calcol, and Darda the sons of Mahol, and his fame was known in all the surrounding nations because he was a great carpenter, because he was a great engineer, because he was a great salesman, because he was the best businessman that ever was. Right? No, that's not what it says. Here is what it says. He spoke 3,000 proverbs, and his songs were 1,005. He spoke of trees, from the cedar that is in Lebanon, even to the hyssop that grows on the wall. He spoke also of animals and birds and creepy things and fish. Men came from all the peoples to hear the wisdom of Solomon, from all the kings of the earth who had heard of his wisdom. That's a pretty incredible, if you really truly think about what the Bible records here as Solomon's wisdom and what it says. There's many, if you go into the Proverbs last night, Jason had brought up how Solomon refers to different things, like he says, go to the ant, you sluggard. He knew enough about the life history, about the life cycle, about what that ant did to learn lessons from that and teach those lessons of God's creation to us that we can learn from. When it's time to harvest, when it's time to work, that ant works hard and gathers all that he needs to do. Because when it comes winter time, that ant's going to be underground. There's not going to be much more gathering. There's a lesson we can learn in that from God's creation. I'm going to try to periodically interject just a few things where maybe somebody can bring up a few points. And I purposely only included one. So does anybody else have any examples of things that is mentioned in the Bible that we can learn from God's creation, from the wisdom aspect from Solomon?
I always watch nature films,
Mm-hmm.
and I learn a lot from it, the difference in species, the different colors,
Mm-hmm.
and the difference.
That shows the vastness of God's creation. How about the wisdom though? Like similar to Proverbs, when Solomon said, "Go to the ant, you sluggard." Is there anything else that we can, Mary?
We are compared to sheep,
Yeah.
and if you raise sheep, you find out they're pretty stupid sometimes. So it's a humbling comparison.
Yes. Any other examples? Corbin?
Doesn't explicitly make nature allegory, but when it says be transformed by the renewing of your mind, I often think of just the transformation of a caterpillar to butterfly is just so vastly different that that's sort of what I think of as that's the extreme. You have to be transformed by the carnal way of thinking to the spiritual mindset. That kind of level of change that you can't even explain.
Right.
You know, so that's something that is just on all of that process because it's just unparalleled. You know, we can't figure out how it works. But it has to. God has to be involved. That kind of change to happen.
Right. One other thing that Jason had brought up last night, which we all know, is God set up his holy day plan around the seasons. And it teaches us of his plan, of what he's doing. So we learn that in the springtime, the harvest, the things grow and there's a first fruits. And see if I can... Is that better? I think that solved it. Maybe this was interfering with it. And then the fall time, the main harvest that comes on. So there's different parts of the seasons. Freeman?
Christ said in Luke, in the 21st chapter, he said, look at the fig trees and learn about what's going to happen. Fig trees don't stand up at summer's end, so we can learn about the return of Christ and what's going to happen in the future. By looking at the fig tree or all the trees.
Right. I don't know if you all heard Freeman. He talked about the fig tree and Christ speaking about learning about the fig tree and about what Christ is going to do with in relationship to that. So those are some things that we can learn through wisdom, just very briefly. Before we go on to the next point, let's turn over to Genesis in chapter 1. Let's establish a premises with God's creation. God is the perfect engineer. He is an architect, an engineer. He has creativity as far as if you think of arts and how people, paint pictures and different things like that, and you look at flowers and the different colors that blend together and the beauty that you can see. God is the perfect biologist. He's the perfect, everything that He does, He is put in order because it perfectly works together. So when we go into Genesis 1 and we look at how God describes His creation, for example, in verse 10, God called the dry land earth, and the gathering of the waters He called seas, and God saw that it was good. He created that. Nothing needed to be changed for Him to call it good. It worked perfectly. Man wasn't around to do anything different, to adjust it, to modify it. He said that it was good the way that He created it. In verse 12, the earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed after their kind, and trees bearing fruit with seed in them after their kind. And God saw that it was good. Let's skip down in verse 17. God placed them in the sky, talking about the two lights, in the expanse of the heavens, to give the light on the earth, and to govern the day and the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. Verse 20, God said, "Let the waters teem with swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth in the open expanse of the heavens." God created the great sea monsters and every living creature that moves with which the waters swarm after their kind, and every winged bird after its kind. And God saw that it was good. And let's skip down to verse 25. God made the beasts of the earth after their kind, and the cattle after their kind, and everything that creeps on the ground after its kind, and saw that it was good. So far, everything that God created, after they were created, it was God determined that it was good. Now I'm going to this is a funny point here. I always enjoyed this. I'll explain this in a minute here. And then God said, "Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and the creeping things of the earth." And God created the man in His own image, in the image of God, and He created him male and female. God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." And then God said, "Behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is on the surface of the earth, and every tree which has fruit, and it shall be food for you. And every beast of the earth, and every bird of the sky, and everything that moves on the earth which has life, I have given every green plant for food." And it was so. Now remember, this is kind of a joke. This is an old Bill Cosby routine, if anybody remembers that. After each individual thing God created, He said it was good. But after He created man, He didn't say it was good. Did He foresee all the trouble that was coming from man? No, it's a joke. But But He did say after that, everything that He created, He saw was very good. But the point here, God did create all things, and then He put them into our hands. He gave us them to use, to rule over, to have for our benefit, to have for food, to use for homes. All these different things He created for our benefit. There's great variety in what He created. And then in chapter 2, verse 6 through 31, I don't think I'm going to read this whole thing here. Let's see. Talks form of the ground, talks about the creation, caused every tree to grow and is pleasing in His sight. In verse 9, talked about where the garden was at. And then in 19, out of the ground the Lord formed the beast of every field and every bird of the sky, and brought them to man to see what he would call them. Last night we read in Isaiah chapter 40 and verse 25, it said that God named all the stars, which I thought was very interesting when thinking about this verse. God named every star that's out there, the planets, everything that's up in the sky. But here in Genesis chapter 2 and verse 19, He brought the living things that He created that man would have direct interaction with. He brought them to Him to name each and everything. He wanted to see, it says He wanted to see what He would call them. And whatever the man called the living creature, that was its name. The man gave names to all the cattle, and to the birds of the sky, and to every beast of the field. And then it goes on talking about there was no helper yet for Adam. I thought it was very interesting that God brought these things to Adam, and then He was very curious to see what Adam thought about them, to what they named. What was He going to do? Well, why is it helpful for us to know the various creatures that live on the earth? We could get to know all these various creatures by getting involved with birding, maybe setting up a bird feeder, or maybe taking hikes along the woods, or sitting along the edge of the creek here with binoculars, looking at the different birds jumping throughout the trees, maybe listening to their songs. Maybe it's some other type of general nature watching. I like to get into the creeks and look at some of the different fish that are in there and some of the different salamanders. There's all the different trees. There's so many different types of trees. Well, why? Why is it important for us to know all these different things? Let's turn to Romans chapter 1. We already read this a little bit. A couple times, I think. But I think it's good to focus in on this again. Romans chapter 1 and verse 19. Romans chapter 1 and verse 19. And I'm just going to jump into the middle of the phrase here. It says, because that which is known about God is evident within them, for God made it evident to them. And verse 20, for since the creation of the world, His inevitable attributes, His eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. His creation, what He has made, the works of His hand, reveal His eternal power and His divine nature. So that's one of the things that nature reveals about God, is His eternal power and His divine nature. Another thing it does, turn over to Psalm 19. And verse 1, Psalm 19 and verse 1. The heavens are telling of the glory of God, and their expanse is declaring the work of His hands. So another thing that it declares is His glory and His works, the works of His hands. What's another thing that we learn about nature that nature reveals about God? Let's turn to Psalm 97. I'm going to read verses 1 through 6, and the key here is verse 6, but Psalm 97, I'm going to start in verse 1. The Lord reigns. Let the earth rejoice. Let the many islands be glad. Clouds and thick darkness surround Him. Righteousness and justice are the foundation of His throne. Fire goes before Him and burns up His adversaries around. His lightnings lit up the world. The earth saw and trembled. The mountains melted like wax at the presence of the Lord, and the presence of the Lord of the whole earth. The heavens declare His righteousness, and all the peoples have seen His glory. Again, this backs up about people seeing God's glory through the creation, but In verse 6, the heavens declare his righteousness also. Let's turn to another scripture in Psalm. Let's turn to Psalm 145. In Psalm 145, verse 1, Psalm 145, verse 1, I will extol you, my God, O King, and I will bless your name forever and ever. Every day I will bless you, and I will praise your name forever and ever. Great is the Lord, and highly to be praised, and his greatness is unsearchable. One generation shall praise your works to another, and shall declare your mighty acts. On the glorious splendor of your majesty, and on your wonderful works I will meditate. Men shall speak of the power of your awesome acts, and I will tell of your greatness. They shall eagerly utter the memory of your abundant goodness, and will shout joyfulness of your righteousness. Here it talks about his works, and it talks about how he will speak of the awesome acts of God, of his greatness, of his goodness, abundant goodness, and his righteousness. But one of the ways it talks, if you notice here in verse 5, it says, on the glorious splendor of your majesty and your wonderful works I will meditate. It talks about meditating on the works of God, what he has created. If we meditate on it, that's where we start to learn the lessons through creation that God has for us. I'm going to turn over back to Proverbs 1:11. We have two more scriptures in this area here. Found this scripture very interesting. Proverbs 1:11 in verse 1 through 4. Proverbs 1:11. It says, praise the Lord. I will give thanks to the Lord with all my heart, in the company of the upright and in the assembly. Great are the works of the Lord. They are studied by all who delight in them. Splendid and majestic is his work, and his righteousness endures forever. He has made his wonders to be remembered. The Lord is gracious and compassionate. Here it talks about remembering and delighting in his works. And it says, great are the works of the Lord. They are studied by all who delight in them. So those who delight in God's works study what he made. It doesn't mean that that's all that consumes your time, but some time should be taken by each one of us to study his works, to find something of God's creation that does interest you and study them. And maybe God will draw a connection between you and something that he has created. One more aspect of God's creation that we're going to look at is in Isaiah. Isaiah 41. Isaiah 41, verses 17 through 20. Isaiah 41, verse 17 through 20. Starting in verse 17. The afflicted and needy are seeking water, but there is none, and their tongue is parched with thirst. I, the Lord, will answer them myself. As the God of Israel, I will not forsake them. I will open rivers on the bare heights, and the springs in the midst of the valleys. I will make the wilderness a pool of water, and the dry land fountains of water. I will put cedars in the wilderness, the acacia and the myrtle, the olive tree, and I will place the juniper in the desert, together with the box tree and cypress, that they may see and recognize and consider and gain insight as well, that the hand of the Lord has done this, and the Holy One of Israel has created it. Now here's a time when God is going to place things somewhere for Israel when they need it. He's going to put it there. And they're going to recognize that He is the one providing for them. There are things all over creation right now where God has placed them in the exact spot where they need to be. They flourish there and they provide great abundance for us to use. Whether it's forests of hardwoods that we use for making furniture or different things like that. Maybe wetlands. He has placed wetlands in different places to filter water out so that we have clean water to drink. He has all kinds of different things where they are in a location that works perfectly. And we see those things working simultaneously together to see that God is a perfect engineer. He knows where they needed to be, how they needed to be designed, and what functions they would play. And they do work perfectly. So we see that in nature, it reveals God. We see His glory, we see His righteousness, we see His works, and we see His goodness. All these different things we can see through what God has created. Another thing we can learn, moving on, is God created diversity. He just didn't create a couple handfuls of things for us to see. He created all kinds of different trees, all kinds of different birds, all kinds of different fishes. You name it. There is so much abundance in the world. Let's go back and read Genesis chapter 6. Here is the time of Noah. In Genesis 6, verse 12, it says, God looked on the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way upon the earth. Then God said to Noah, the end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence because of them, and behold, I am about to destroy them with the earth. Make for yourself an ark of gopher wood. You shall make the ark with rooms, and shall cover it inside and out with pitch. This is how you shall make it. And he talks about the length. And he said, behold, I am bringing the flood waters on the earth to destroy all flesh which is breathed, which is the breath of life. From under heaven, everything that is on the earth shall perish. But I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall enter the ark, you and your sons and your wives and your sons' wives with you. But he didn't just stop there. And he said, and, in verse 19, of every living thing of all the flesh you shall bring 2 of every kind into the ark, and keep them alive with you. They shall be male and female, of the birds after their kind, and of the animals after their kind, of every creeping thing of the ground after its kind. 2 of every kind will come to you, and to you to keep them alive. God wanted to preserve the diversity of the animals that He had created. He brought them to Noah so that when He destroyed the earth through the flood, when the waters receded, He would have diversity back on the earth again. He ensured that the diversity of the different animals that He created would carry on. And I kind of looked up some information, and I thought this was really interesting here. Now, when it talked about Adam describing all the animals, everything that was on the earth, and God was curious to see what they would call them. Well, the biologists are still describing new animals that they have never seen before, that have not been described. And currently, of all the species that have been described by science, there are 1,740,330 different organisms that live on this earth that have been each described by science. And they're still describing new species. I think God does. I mean, He said in Genesis He was curious as to what Adam would call these things. And whenever scientists discover these new individuals, new different species, completely different from another species, they come up with a name, they look into their life history and what they do, how they eat, how they sleep, what their function is, how they exist on this earth. I think God is interested in us doing that, as he said in Genesis. Some of the examples are, let's see here. Lichens. There have been 17,000 different lichens described on this earth. Red and green algae. There's been 10,134 different kinds of red and green algae. These little teeny tiny things. Microscopic. You need a microscope to look at them. And yet, at looking at these things under a microscope, there's so much diversity in the species that there's 10,134 different kinds that you can individually describe under a microscope. Flowering plants. I love in the springtime going to see the spring wildflowers bloom. And in the summertime, there's all kinds of different flowers that bloom. There's trees that bloom. The smallest plant is a flowering plant is this plant called duckweed. And I think it's milfoil, and it's this little tiny plant that grows on ponds. And the leaf on this thing. It has one little tiny small leaf that you could just. It's not much bigger than the lead in this pencil, and it has little roots that dangle down underneath this plant, and it has a little teeny tiny flower on that thing. That's the smallest flowering plant. But the different flowering plants that have been described, 281,821 different flowering plants. How about ferns? When you go out into the wood, there's a fern. Well, there's 12,000 different ferns and horsetails that grow out there. How about mammals? 5,490 different mammals have been described on this earth. That's all the different kinds of bears, all the different kinds of mice, all the different kinds of horses, all these different things. There's 5,000. Fishes. You talk about the fishes of the sea. And people have taken the time to identify them. There's 31,300 different types of fishes that have been described in the oceans and streams and rivers. Now, they're going down and diving. The deeper they go, they're finding more and more different types of species out there. The vast waters of the oceans of this planet, can you imagine how many new species are out there that have never been seen before? Insects. Insects are by far the most diverse of them all. There's been over 1 million different types of insects described. Spiders and scorpions, the things we love. Well, God must have seen something interesting in them because He's created 102,248 different types of spiders and scorpions. The diversity is incredible. So if you look at this and you look at all the different things that are out there, it's incredible of God's creation. Now, if you look at the diversity too, God has created things that survive and can breed or continue their species in various and sometimes very specific conditions. Now, right now, we're all praying for the people out in Colorado because of the vast wildfires. Because wildfires can be very extremely dangerous and destructive. But at the same time, God created wildfires to replenish the soil. When wildfires burn through a forest area, it takes this matter, the decaying wood that's been sitting there, and it converts it to a soil that's very fertile, and it's very good for the soil. And God has actually created pine trees, and their cones, the cones only open up and release their seeds when fire goes through and the temperatures rise enough for those pine trees to release their seeds. It's called, one of the trees that does that is the lodgepole pine. So the only way this pine tree continue having new species come into the ecosystem is if a fire specifically comes through. It's one of the things they learn. It's a fire ecology as a whole thing that the people are beginning to understand, that fire going through a forest is not something that's awful bad. Another interesting creature that I'll tell you about, we find this along very clean streams, but it's called a bombardier beetle. And if anybody has the internet, they can look on YouTube and you can type in bombardier beetle and see this beetle in action. And in its abdomen, it has a gland on top and a gland on bottom. And each one of these glands has two separate types of chemicals, two different chemicals. And when this beetle feels threatened by an insect, it could be a spider or whatever it is, it could be a lizard, he'll turn and he'll face his abdomen towards that, whatever it's coming after him, and he'll eject these two different chemicals. And when these chemicals combine, and they have to combine outside the body, they actually create an explosion that burns these animals. We've caught them up on some of the rivers, and if you catch them, you'll get a purple blister on your hand that's about the size of, I don't know, maybe a 1/16 of an inch in diameter. But it burns your finger. Imagine if that chemical combined inside the body, what would happen to the insect? I mean, the insect couldn't survive. The beetle couldn't survive. And it's incredible that this beetle specifically it only lives along stream systems that haven't been channelized, that haven't been ditched and all that stuff. They have to have a good substrate of gravel along the side of the stream, and the water quality has to be very good too. It can't have poor water quality. And they live in those situations. There's all kinds of different things. Part of my job is training volunteers to look at the insects that live in the stream. Now, Adam described all the different bugs, and people are describing the different bugs. And God even said the creeping things Noah brought onto the ark. There's certain bugs. If anybody is a fly fisherman here, some of the flies that you tie are mayflies and stonefly nymphs, Helgramite, different things like that live in the stream systems. Now, we look at these bugs and we say, hey, listen, we want this river has these bugs in it, and we want to make sure these bugs stay there. Well, it's not necessarily because of those bugs. Those bugs live there because the water is clean, and we need clean water so that it's cheaper for us to treat the water systems before we drink it. You think of all these tributaries that go into Lake Erie, and Paynesville, Cleveland, Ashtabula, Oconee, all these cities all along the lake up there, they draw their water supply from the lake. Well, if the water that's coming into that lake is polluted, how much more expensive is it for us to treat that water for us to drink? All the chemicals that may be going in there. Well, these bugs are indicators. God has created these insects so that some of them only live in very clean water. If you have silt that comes, too much silt in there, and they cover up the rocks, they won't live there anymore. And most of the time when too much silt comes in, the nutrients jump up in the water and the algae blooms happen. And there's different algae out there that release toxins in the water that are harmful for us. So there's all kinds of diversity in God's creation. Another thing that we can learn in the Bible is God has described different types of conservation practices in the Bible. Now, the first one that I would like to turn to is in Leviticus 25, verse 4. Leviticus 25, verse 4. This is talking about the different sabbatical years. And first he starts out, we're going to start off in verse 1. And the Lord spoke to Moses at Mount Sinai, saying, when you come into the land which I give you, then the land shall have a Sabbath to the Lord. 6 years you shall sow your field, and 6 years you shall prune your vineyard and gather the crop. But during the 7th year the land shall have a Sabbath rest, a Sabbath before the Lord. You shall not sow your field, nor prune your vineyard. Your harvest aftergrowth you shall not reap, and your grapes of the untrimmed vines you shall not gather, and the land shall have a sabbatical year. All of you shall have the Sabbath products of the land for the food yourselves, and your male and female slaves, and your hired hand, your foreign resident, and those who live with aliens. In this aspect of having a sabbatical year, of not tilling the land, of letting it go fallow and growing up, what happens is nitrogen-fixing plants will grow abundantly, and they'll fix the nitrogen cycle. The productivity of the land will gain back. You'll have all this dense vegetation that grows up. And then that 8th year that you come back after the 7th year, you plow this vegetation back into the field. It adds this organic matter back into the soil. So you've had this year of the seeds growing, getting in there, and the nitrogen-fixing plants fixing nitrogen into the soil. And then this organic matter, and it adds. And anybody knows if you have a garden, you try to add leaves to your garden. You try to add different things to the soil to get that productivity and keep that productivity maintained. But here is one of the benefits. It's not. I don't think God had said, "Here's conservation practice." It was a Sabbath lesson in there. But as a result of this 7th year Sabbath, was a conservation practice that helped the soil maintain its productivity. How about another one in Deuteronomy 22? Deuteronomy 22, verse 6 through 7. I thought this was really interesting to have this interjection in the law here that's being repeated. Deuteronomy 22, verse 6. If you happen to come upon a bird's nest along the way in any tree or on the ground with young ones or with eggs, and the mother sitting on the young or on the eggs, you shall not take the mother with the young. You shall certainly let the mother go, but the young you may take for yourself, in order that it may be well with you, and that you may prosper your days. Here is just a simple little thing of God saying, hey, allow this mom to take off. If you have the eggs in the nest, she may come back and lay another nest, and that species can continue. It's one way of preserving and showing, God's creation of not just taking that. Here's this bird, and I'm just going to take all of it. I want this bird, and I'm going to eat it, and I'm going to take it all. It's a way of leaving part of it. Not totally thinking of yourself, but also thinking of the future, of that bird being able to provide more to you in the future, and keeping that diversity. Now in Genesis 1, verse 27 through 31, we read this before, and it said, God had created man and woman in his image. Then he said to subdue and have dominion over all things. And he said that all that he created was good. Now what is an example that God or Christ or both gives us about having dominion over something? How about we turn to Matthew 20? When we have dominion over something, does that mean we just use it till our heart's content? We look at our wants and our desires and our needs and just run away with that? Or is there something else to consider when having dominion over something? Matthew 20. In verse 25, in verse 25 it says, But Jesus called them to himself and said, You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great men exercise authority over them. And I think the King James, when I did the search on this, said dominion over them. It is not this way among you, but whoever wishes to become great among you shall be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you shall be your slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many. The key thing here is in having dominion, don't lord it over somebody. Well, we have dominion over creation. Do we just sit there and take what God has created and just abuse it? Do we use all of it up so that there's nothing left? in an area? No, we have to be wise about what we use. We have to have consideration for others. When considering subduing and having dominion over a property, or our piece of land, we need to consider how our neighbor is affected. In Leviticus 19, verse 18, it speaks about loving your neighbor. Same with Mark 12, verse 31, and Luke 10, verse 27. In Romans 13, verse 10, it says, love works no ill to his neighbor. So what we're doing on our property, how we're managing our house, how we're managing our land, do we consider how it is going to affect our neighbor? If a farmer owns a farm and he plows right up to the border of, I know right here's the line, our property line, and this is where I'm going to plow my field right up to that property line, and I'm going to have the max amount of production on my property that I can possibly have, and I'm going to plant corn right up to that property line. Now, how is that going to affect your neighbor? When you have corn crops that are growing, when it rains, that rain does not have a whole lot of friction when it hits that soil, so it washes the soil off. And so is that soil going to be washed onto your neighbor's property? How about if you live next to a stream and a farmer plows his field right up to that edge of the field and all that sediment goes into the stream, and then that erosion starts to happen and it goes downstream to his neighbor's property? How about if there's no buffer between the stream and where he's spreading manure on his field? And when it rains, or maybe his field is tiled and he spreads liquid manure on that field, and the tile carries that manure right down to the stream. How is that affecting his neighbor? How about the things we do in our homes? How about the things we do, wherever we're at? Do we take our trash and just throw it on the ground? Is that thinking about our neighbor, or is it just a selfless act of just tossing it out? Let's go back to Leviticus 25. In considering loving our neighbor and using the land. We're going to go back to that sabbatical year here that it talks about. In Leviticus 25 and verse 8. You are to count off 7 Sabbaths of years for yourself, 7 times 7 years, so that you have a time of 7 Sabbaths of years, namely 49 years. You shall then sound a ram's horn abroad on the 10th day of the 7th month, on the day of atonement. You shall sound the horn throughout your land. You shall thus consecrate the 50th year and proclaim a release through the land to all of its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you, and each of you shall return to his own property, and each of you shall return to his family. You shall have the 50th year as a jubilee. Now most of us know that in the year of Jubilee, if you sold off your family land, you could sell it off to someone who wanted to use it for 50 years. But God wanted that land to return back to the family. It was important for each family to have his own land. Now, let's think about something here. If we purchase this land off of somebody, knowing that would go back to that family in the Jubilee year, and that family was to be able to use that land, how are we to treat that land? When these things are reestablished in the kingdom in the 1,000-year reign, what if somebody says, well, I've bought this land and now I'm going to put a garbage dump on there? How about a landfill? If you put a landfill on that property, is that person going to be able to come back and use his land on the Jubilee year? If you put a landfill on that land, you're never, ever, ever going to be able to use that land again the same way that you did. Now, some old landfills that were buried deep, they put schools on them, and then they have to put these pilings in that are, you know how deep they are. In Barberton, they have these pilings down in their new high school, and it shifts, and they have all these structural problems, and they try to reuse this land, but it never, ever is what God intended and how he created that land. I know one of the things that kind of, it's just a product of what I see, and I see these landfills going on. They're hundreds of feet high, and they're mounds, and you'll never be able to use them again for anything. So I mean, I'm not griping on anybody here, but when I come here and we have all these paper plates and all these plasticware that we use and we just toss it in the trash, where's that going? It really is contributing to not being able to use that land ever again. I mean, it's a contribution to that. When we come to church and we have all these plastic bottles, and they get thrown in the trash, it's space that's taken up. It's land that is never going to be used again. When God created that Jubilee year, He intended for that family to be able to come back and have that restoration of their land and be able to use it again. Just kind of something that kind of gets on me a little bit, but there's all kinds of different things you could think about when you think of that. You think of when a chemical company, we all use chemicals, and we can use chemicals, and they have some good uses. But if they take and dump those chemicals on a property, I just worked on a project up on the Ashtabula River, and from the 1950s up to the 1970s, the chemical companies, they just dumped their chemical byproducts into the stream and flowed down into the Ashtabula Harbor. The companies spent a few $1 million to clean that up, but the government spent the rest of the $70 million to clean that up. How expensive is it to post-clean up all these products when we could have very cheaply came up with a way to dispose of it if we would have just thought about it in the first place? If we would have just thought, how am I treating my neighbor? All those people downstream. The next point that I have is just a couple other considerations. Let's turn to Hosea, chapter 4. This really isn't a point, it's just a couple other considerations to think about when thinking about nature and how it relates to God. Hosea chapter 4 and verse 1 through 3. Verse 1. Listen to the word of the Lord, O sons of Israel, for the Lord has a case against the inhabitants of the land, because there is no faithfulness or kindness or knowledge of the Lord in the land. There is swearing, deception, murder, stealing, and adultery. They employ violence so that bloodshed follows bloodshed. Therefore, the land mourns, and everyone who lives in it languishes, along with the beasts of the field and the birds of the sky. And this is kind of interesting that I thought. And also the fish of the sea disappear. Right now, fisheries biologists who study fisheries out in the oceans, the salmon runs and all these different things, are noticing population declines in the fishes that are out there. The mercury content in these fishes is increasing. The sinfulness of our nature carries on how we treat the land. It's how much respect we have for God. I know one of the things that I thought about when I thought about how I treat creation is I kind of related it to when I lived in my dad's house. My dad provided me a home to live in growing up. And I was to appreciate that home. If I showed appreciation to my father for providing that home for me, would I punch holes in the wall? Would I take, maybe when you're young, 1 or 2 years old, you don't know any better, and you take a crayon and draw on the walls. But would I go in the living room when I was 15 and start drawing all over the walls with a crayon? Would I just leave my trash around? Would I leave dishes around for my dad to clean up? No, as me respecting my father in his home, I would treat his home that he has provided for me with respect. I would help keep it clean. I would help maintain it. I would help keep it nice. Well, I kind of look at what God has provided us on this earth as He has provided us a home. He's provided this for us. So a way that I can help show respect to Him is by doing my part in trying to respect what He has given to me, treating it well, doing good things to it, not abusing it. And that's kind of a way that I try to talk about conservation practices to different people. Another scripture that I thought was very interesting, and it's kind of interjected in Revelation chapter 11. Revelation chapter 11 This is the second to last scripture. In verse 18, let me just make sure I got the right one. Revelation 11. Okay, yes. And the nations were enraged, and your wrath came, and the time came for the dead to be judged, and the time to reward your bondservants, the prophets and the saints, and those who fear your name, and the small and the great, and to destroy those who destroy the earth. I thought that statement was interesting. When God talks about, we read all those scriptures about we learn to respect God, we learn the joy of God, we learn the righteousness of God, we learn of His great works, we learn of all these different things. If we know that He has provided these things for us and we still destroy what He has provided for us, are we having respect for Him? It's just kind of some thought process I have. There's also a lot of sin that's involved in this. When we have sin in our lives, that also destroys what God has created for us spiritually. It destroys our relationships and all those different things. But it was just something interesting that I found. And part of my job is looking at different ways to respect God's creation. I'm going to be closing here in another minute or so. And one of the things when I work with contractors on like state highway jobs, and one of the things that they get very frustrated with is they'll say is when they come in to put a new road in, and they have to clear trees. Well, they say, those bats, we can't clear these trees until if we didn't do it in the wintertime, well, we can't do it because of these bats. These bats just get in the way. Well, think about this for a second. One bat will eat over 1,000 insects in one night, including mosquitoes. Now, if we're continually doing things that do away with the bats, what's going to control the mosquitoes and the gnats and all these different things that bite us and eat on us and all these different things? Instead, we're having to spray chemicals in the air. I live in Orville, and they go through and spray chemicals to control insects. How is that good for us? Isn't it much better to use God's wisdom in the animals that He provided for us to control the insects? I know right now in Pennsylvania, the populations of bats are declining so quickly. There's one hibernaculum in Pennsylvania where the population was 40,000 bats, and they went to survey it the next year, and there's only like 100 left of that population of 40,000 bats. There's this fungus that's coming in, and they're having to block off with gates so that people can't go into that area and carry this fungus into those caves. We're having some jeopardy here. God created the system and worked together perfectly, and what He has created to control itself it's getting ruined. There's other things that we do when you look at when we consider God, in construction, that some of the contractors it slows them down a little bit, but really, in all reality, it was just poor planning on their behalf. If you did clear the shagbark hickory tree in the wintertime when the bats are hibernating, then they're not in that roosting tree when you cut it down and kill them. So they can find another roosting tree when they come out of hibernation if you cut it down in the wintertime. It's just planning. You're going to construct this highway, so plan properly. Don't blame it on the stupid bat. We need those bats that God gave us. The other last thing I'd like to just very quickly touch on is Romans 1:25, and we already covered this today. And it talks about not worshiping the creation. Although we are to greatly appreciate what God has given us, we have to be very careful that we don't become and do things that worship God's creation. Now, all kinds of different aspects come into worshiping God's creation. You can look at the extreme environmentalists like Greenpeace and some of these places who, although I do greatly believe that animals should be preserved, and we should do all that we can to preserve the variety, each and every species that God created. He created them for a reason. And so if an animal is endangered, it's usually because of a practice that we've done that makes that animal endangered. In Ohio, there's a hellbender salamander, and somebody may say, "Oh, just a dumb salamander." It's a salamander that gets this big, and it lives in the Little Beaver Creek and Kokosing River and Yellow Creek, and there's a few streams that it lives in. But it's because of our activities that these other streams can't support this giant salamander any longer. So should we take time to look at the stream and say, "Hey, listen, this is the only place left where this organism lives"? Should we take extra caution and say maybe we shouldn't build this school over that area? Or maybe we shouldn't put this road, ditch this stream or do that to keep this part of God's creation? It's just something to think about. But we don't want to come to the point where we worship the creation. There's the West, or the European Wiccans and Druids and different pagan societies that worshipped creation and came up with all kinds of rituals such as Christmas that we now, the Christians now keep is to worship God. That's a sun worshiping practice. Easter, another practice that the Druids and all those pagan societies came up with to worship the creation. Hindus have all kinds of things. They have yoga moves and all these things that worship the creation. They're designed specifically to worship the creation. And again, environmentalists, they'll sit there and they'll act like Mr. Miller said in his message. They'll say that you can't kill the egg of an eagle, but you can wipe out the human, population by killing, infants in the womb. They're putting the creation more important than man. We have to be very careful that we don't do those things. But we also have to respect the creation. Well, that's all that I have today. I don't know if anybody has any questions or anything to add. Any scriptures that you know of that discuss these things. And I don't know if maybe anybody wants to talk about when God talks about the nature of animals in the kingdom. That's something that's discussed a lot in when Christ returns. But kind of open it up, or if everybody is done, we'll be done.
I got a question.
Okay.
What happens if you think we're worshiping dogs and cats if we're putting them as family member or as close as some people make them? Is that considered worship?
No, I don't think that's. I don't think that's having a pet is worshiping an animal. You're not praying to the pet. You're not. I guess somebody could worship a pet. There's different cultures that worship different animals. We know the Greeks or the Egyptians. They had different gods that had the different animal heads, and they had the eagle on the one head of the beast. They worship that animal, and there's different societies. They had cats that they worship. So if they actually make a god out of them, then yeah. But having a pet is not worshiping the pet.
I think there's a big difference between the word love and worship.
Yeah.
You can love that pet, and that's not worshiping.
Right. You can love each other and not worship each other.
Sure. Not make an idol out of anything.
Right. Somebody else have?
Well, that's what I was basically going to say. You can worship your child for that matter.
Yeah. Yeah.
You can worship your friend, you can worship your wife, you can worship your husband, you can worship your minister, you can worship all kinds of things.
Right.
So, and none of it's right.
Yeah.
Except for that.
Right. Mrs. Cunningham, you have?
I was just wondering, what happens if a bird fell out of its nest and he puts it back in the nest, but I've heard that the scent of you touching the bird will keep the parent from touching it.
Yeah, I don't know the total truth in that. I'm not sure about that. Yep.
The fear of the eternal, isn't that more referred to if you love God and you'll respect Him and do that? I've heard the terminology fear, it could also mean to love God and respect His word and
Right.
do what He says rather than stand and tremble.
Right. I mean, there's both. There's both. I mean, if we have fear of God, we do have a fear that knowing that if we don't commit to Him, we will be destroyed. We will enter eternal death. I mean, I think we should have a healthy fear of that. That is something that we should have a healthy fear of that. But also having the fear of the Lord and respecting Him and obeying Him, and that is a different type of fear that is also healthy and we need to have. So I think both are important.
Fear is also awe.
Fear is what?
Awe. A-W-E.
Awe. Yes, awe of God. Yes. I think that's all I have, so